In the late 1990s, the world was grappling with the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, a tumultuous period that sent shockwaves through economies and financial systems across the region. As governments, central banks, and international organizations struggled to find effective solutions, a small gathering of finance ministers and central bank governors from 19 major economies and the European Union convened in Berlin in response to the crisis. This meeting marked the birth of the Group of 20, or the G20 as we know it today. So at that time, the G7, which is a group of 7 major industrialized nations, was considered the primary forum for international economic cooperation. However, the Asian financial crisis exposed the limitations of this exclusive club. This crisis did not originate in the club of industrialized Western countries, but it had global repercussions which even the G7 could not handle. Recognizing the need for a more broader, inclusive platform for discussions on global economic stability, the G20 was formed. The inaugural G20 took place in 1999 in Berlin, in Germany. The gathering aimed to facilitate candid conversations among finance ministers and central bank governors of both advanced as well as emerging economies. The turning point came after the 2008 global financial crisis, a catastrophic event which reshaped the world's economic landscape. The G20's relevance suddenly surged as the crisis underscored the interconnectedness of economies and the need for coordinated action on a global scale. In 2008, the G20 held an emergency summit in Washington, D.C., which marked its transformation from being a finance-focused forum to a platform for global leaders. It got a much-required facelift from finance ministers and central bank governors to the men and women who actually run the planet. Today, 15 years after that meeting, the world has changed so much, and so has the prevailing global order. Tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate on the back of the Ukraine war. There is an all-round new Cold War that's going on between the United States and China. That Cold War encompasses military and trade to critical emerging technology, space race. The G20's relevance and also its inherent challenge therein has been further fractioned as the war has pushed both Moscow and Beijing closer to forming an axis against the West, led by the United States and its European partners. Now, this poses as big a challenge for neutral third powers like India, which is the host of this year's G20. Today, the G20 is not just a finance and economic stock shop. It has transitioned from a crisis management forum to a platform for addressing broader global challenges. The G20's agenda has expanded. It now includes issues like climate change, sustainable development, even global health on the back of the COVID pandemic. This evolution reflects a recognition that economic stability cannot be isolated from more long-term sustainable development, whether it is in power equations or also simply in the overall survivability of the current global order. Now, this current global order has been in existence since the end of the Cold War, that's the early 1990s. But that current world order is being increasingly threatened by an emerging new world order which is fraught with tensions. The rise of China and Russia as major global players has introduced a new set of dynamics. On the one side, there is a shift in power dynamics with Russia and China challenging the dominance of Western economies. On the other side, the West is seeking to maintain its influence and uphold its values on the global stage. Now, the G20 is the ideal platform for these diverse powers to engage in dialogue, negotiation, and hopefully some cooperation. But the world is far from an ideal place. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has exposed deep-rooted fault lines within the G20. The differing stands taken by member states on this issue highlight the challenges of finding common ground when faced with conflicting interests. The West, which includes the United States, the European Union, and other Western partners, has been extremely critical of Russia's actions in Ukraine and has imposed sanctions on Russia and Russian entities. In contrast, China and some other third countries like India, for example, have adopted a more neutral position, emphasizing the importance of non-interference in domestic affairs. And these very divisions underscore the difficulties in achieving a consensus within the G20. In fact, in the last edition in Bali, negotiators had to work overtime and settle for just a passing reference to the Ukraine war in order to be able to thrash out a joint statement. This time, though, the chances of a joint statement look even more bleak. And that is where India comes in. India's participation in the G20 reflects its commitment to global cooperation and its own unique philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, which translates to the world is one family. Rooted in ancient Indian wisdom, this philosophy shapes India's foreign policy by emphasizing inclusivity, mutual respect, and shared well-being. India's presence in the G20 and the fact that it's the host this year is a testament to its belief in fostering global harmony and addressing collective challenges. Now, while India's approach aligns with peace mediation, trying to broker an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a complex endeavor. India's historic neutrality and respect for sovereignty might position it as a potential mediator, but the intricate geopolitics involved therein demands cautious navigation. India's diplomatic finesse could play a role in facilitating dialogue, but ultimately, the resolution of this conflict depends entirely on the willingness of the conflicting parties. So the leaders of both Russia and China, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, will skip this year's G20 summit, even though it is hosted by a non-Western power. Unambiguous signal that the world has been split into two camps, and even a third neutral country like India is being forced to choose sides. For India, these woes are also hitting much closer home, because for the last 3 years, India has been beset in border tensions with China along what both sides call the line of actual control. China, back in 2020, tried to unilaterally change the status quo by forcibly occupying territories which were up until then under dispute. It led to a flare-up in the icy heights of the Himalayas, which led to the death of 20 Indian soldiers. China, too, lost a number of its soldiers, but China has never officially acknowledged its dead. The estimates vary from 4 to 50. There have been multiple rounds of military, diplomatic, and political meetings, but the issue has still not been resolved. The G20's ability to navigate these fault lines and maintain its relevance depends on its capacity to facilitate dialogue amongst its various members. Now, while differing viewpoints are inevitable, the G20's role as perhaps the only forum for frank discussions at the highest level can perhaps lead to greater understanding and potentially also some solutions. In a world that's been marked by tensions between Russia and China on the one hand and the West on the other, the G20 is perhaps the only bridge for some dialogue and cooperation. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has brought to light the G20's challenges in finding consensus amidst divided and diverse interests. However, the G20's potential to shape a more stable and prosperous world remains significant. The onus now is on the member states of the G20 to navigate these fault lines with some deft diplomacy, pragmatism, and a shared commitment to global well-being.